Hi everybody, my name is Ann Pierce and I coordinate the Wisconsin First Detector Network, which is our statewide citizen science network for invasive species monitoring. And today I'm going to talk to you about invasive plants. There are a lot of different definitions of invasive plants, and sometimes we get confused about whether all weeds are invasive plants or whether all invasive plants are weeds. So let's start with the basic question, what is a weed? If you look at this field of dandelions, you might think that it's a weedy field. Somebody else might think that it's a great source of salad. So really, a weed is just a plant out of place. This is clearly a subjective definition. For one person, a plant might be a great pollinator plant for our native pollinators. For another person, that plant might be considered a weed. Weeds can be native or non-native. And in general, our non-native plants can be considered either casual plants or naturalized. Casual non-native plants are those that cannot persist on their own. They need humans to help them persist in our landscape. And naturalized non-native plants are plants that can persist on their own. They do not need humans to help them reproduce and persist on our landscape. Let's look at a few examples. Here's a common native weed. You might recognize it as giant ragweed. So this is considered a weed by many people because it grows aggressively large, and it's also an allergen. It is not considered an invasive plant, however. An example of a casual non-native plant is something like a tulip. As you know, tulips are common garden plants, but they don't persist on the landscape without humans continually propagating them and planting them. Here's an example of a naturalized non-native plant. This is Timothy grass, which is native to Europe, and it doesn't need humans to help it persist, and it is especially good at persisting in pastures. But it hasn't been documented as spreading very far, and so this is not considered invasive either. So what is an invasive plant? First off, invasive plants are naturalized non-native plants. So these are non-native plants that can persist and spread on their own without human intervention. In addition, invasive plants have the tendency to grow or spread rapidly in their non-native range. And finally, invasive plants cause or have the potential to cause harm. And this includes economic harm, environmental harm, and harm to human health. So for a plant to be considered invasive, it needs to have all three of these characteristics. So a classic example of an invasive plant, which many of you might recognize, is garlic mustard. This plant is native to Europe, and although it was originally brought to the United States and to Wisconsin by humans, it no longer needs humans to help it persist on the landscape. So it's become naturalized, it spreads and persists on its own. In addition, it has that third characteristic of being harmful, particularly to the environment. For example, it creates monospecific stands, so often when it invades forest floors, it's one of the only plants growing there. And it's also an allelopathic plant, so it exudes chemicals from its roots that alter the soil composition, making it difficult for other plants to germinate and persist. So now you might be asking, well, how do I know which plants are invasive here in Wisconsin? Wisconsin has an invasive species rule in our state statutes, and it's called the NR40 rule. This rule is primarily meant to be an educational rule to educate Wisconsin's citizens about invasive species. And the goal of this law is to prevent the introduction of new invasive species and the spread of invasive species that we currently have in the state. NR40 lists over 200 species as invasive in our state, and about 150 of these are plants. Each of the invasive species is categorized as either a prohibited species or a restricted species. Let's talk about those classifications. Prohibited species are those that either are not in the state yet or they're here in very small numbers. And that means that these species could be eradicated completely from the state. In terms of regulations for prohibited species, you're not allowed to have these species. In addition, you're not allowed to move them, buy or sell them, or introduce them. Restricted species are those species that are already pretty widespread in Wisconsin, so there's not much of a chance of eradicating them statewide, although they still could be eradicated at a more local level. The regulations are almost the same as prohibited species, although you'll note that you are allowed to possess restricted species. Any listed invasive species, if you have it on your property, you are highly encouraged to remove it. If it's a prohibited species, you can be forced by regulatory action to remove or control that species. Let's look at some examples of prohibited and restricted species. On the left, we have kudzu, which fortunately isn't in Wisconsin yet, but if you're familiar with kudzu, you know that it's the plant that swallowed the South. This is considered a prohibited species in Wisconsin because it has been moving further north towards our southern border, and we know that if this species were to enter Wisconsin, it could create a lot of problems if it's not managed properly. And so this is a prohibited species that's essentially on a watch list right now. We want to make sure that if and when it enters Wisconsin, we can manage it right away. Garlic mustard is an example of a restricted species. As I said earlier, it's widespread across the state, and that's the case with many of our restricted species. They're fairly common. Probably most of the invasive species that you recognize are restricted. And if you're interested in seeing the whole list of regulated invasive species, you can visit the DNR website and type NR40 into the search box, and you'll be able to access the list of regulated species. Although we have over 200 listed invasive species in Wisconsin, there are many more species, and plants in particular, that have invasive tendencies and may be added to the invasive species list upon further revision of the NR40 rule. So if you're looking in your yard or garden or out in a natural area, you might consider taking a closer look at some of your plants and thinking about whether they might be invasive. So first off, if it's not native to Wisconsin, it might be invasive. If it grows aggressively or spreads rapidly, that's an indication that it could have invasive tendencies. In addition, if it produces a high number of seeds, this is a common characteristic of invasive plants. And finally, if its seeds are easily dispersed by wind or birds or other methods, then it might be invasive. In particular, if you have a plant that has multiple of these characteristics, you should watch it closely and see if it's spreading rapidly. And if so, you might consider managing that plant to prevent it from causing damage, either in your own garden or yard or in natural areas beyond your yard. Now, invasion is a process. A non-native plant could show up in Wisconsin, but it doesn't automatically mean it's going to be invasive. So I'm going to illustrate the invasion process using this graph. On the left side of the graph, we have the area infested by an invasive plant, and on the bottom of the graph, going from left to right, we have time moving on. When a plant is initially introduced, of course, it's in a very small area. It's not infesting a large area yet. Once that plant has the ability to persist or become naturalized, then it starts increasing the area infested and can do so pretty rapidly. And this is the point at which the plant is usually detected. Unfortunately, the public doesn't generally become aware of a new invasive plant or species until that invasive plant has rapidly increased the area infested. And of course, that means that the costs to control that plant have rapidly increased as well. So one of the goals of the First Detector Network and the NR40 rule in educating people about invasive species is to move detection earlier in the invasion process, therefore being able to manage these plants at a lower cost and more efficiently. Now that you have an idea of the general process that happens with an invasive plant, you might be wondering how long it is before a plant actually becomes invasive once it's been introduced into its non-native range. So here's a quiz. You can think about the answer in your head, whether invasive species become invasive immediately. Does it take 5 to 10 years, 30 to 50 years, or maybe more than 50 years? Well, it turns out any of these answers can be true. Moving away from plants, something like emerald ash borer is immediately invasive when it arrives in a new area. Something like Callery or Bradford pear, however, took a little longer to become invasive. It was introduced in the United States as bare rootstock in the early 1900s, and by the 1950s it was very widely planted as an ornamental street tree. But already by the 1960s, it was noted for its invasive tendencies, particularly further to the south and east of Wisconsin. This tree is so widely planted that now we're seeing it starting to become invasive in Wisconsin as well. So if you think about the invasion curve that we just looked at, and the fact that species might become invasive immediately or it might take several years or decades, it's important to consider being careful with plants that might not be considered invasive yet, but they could be further down the road. Many of you are probably familiar with impacts of invasive plants, but I'd like to share a few examples of some specific impacts here. Often invasive plants are well known for providing direct competition with many of our beloved native plants. Here's an example with wild chervil, which is very commonly seen along roadsides but grows in other areas as well. This is a plant that comes out early in the spring, and it's flowering typically in late May or early June, meaning that it completes its life cycle much earlier in the season than a lot of other plants. So it can physically crowd out space, and by the nature of its kind of early completion of its life cycle, it's directly competing with other species that might otherwise be able to grow. Other plants, particularly our invasive shrubs that grow in our forests, alter succession. Succession is the process in forests where older trees that are kind of the upper layer of the canopy, when they die and create new space and new light, typically there is a generation of shorter or younger trees growing in the understory that can then take advantage of the new light resources and grow taller and become the new canopy layer. With invasive shrubs like the common buckthorn pictured here or honeysuckle, these shrubs create such a dense layer of shade that new tree seedlings aren't able to germinate. And so when the old canopy trees die, there's nothing in the ready to fill the ecological niche that they once had. And so you're left with a very dense shrub layer, but no recruitment of new trees to create the new tall canopy layer. Other invasive plants, in addition to crowding out native species, can cause cascading changes to the environment. And here we'll talk about Japanese knotweed. Knotweed is a particularly pernicious plant, and it actually creates a lot of problems for infrastructure, including concrete foundations, asphalt paving, and the like. But one of the more important environmental impacts that Japanese knotweed has is its tendency to create soil erosion problems. Japanese knotweed does very well in riparian areas along stream banks and rivers. And of course, if you have soil erosion along waterways, that contributes to water quality issues. So in addition to causing abrupt and long-standing changes in the plant community, Japanese knotweed also contributes to these cascading environmental issues like soil erosion, which leads to water quality issues. It's also important to think about the impact of invasive plants on habitat for wildlife. There's a lot of documentation about how our non-native and invasive ornamental plants provide poor habitat for birds, in particular because it provides poor habitat for bird food. And when we talk about bird food, we mean insects and the caterpillar stage of insects. Here's an example of a plant that provides poor habitat for pollinators, though, purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife is a beautiful plant and it often grows in our wetlands. And while pollinators do use this plant, imagine what this wetland will look like shortly after the purple loosestrife stops blooming. If purple loosestrife is one of the only blooming, flowering plants in this area, and then it passes out of its blooming period, there's nothing left for the pollinators to forage on. And so while invasive plants are crowding out other species and creating these monospecific stands, where they're pretty much the only plant growing, we need to consider that that's providing poor habitat for our pollinators and other animals. Of course, there are some invasive plants that are also problematic for human health, and wild parsnip is a classic example of this. Many of you are probably familiar with wild parsnip because if you get the sap of the plant on your skin and your skin is exposed to UV light, it causes a burn, and that's known as phytophotodermatitis. So we need to be careful about plants like wild parsnip in areas where we recreate or garden or have a lot of other activity. So now we've covered a lot of negative impacts of invasive plants, but the good news is there's a lot of actions you can take to help prevent the introduction and spread of invasive plants, and you can start right in your own garden or yard. If you're buying new plants for your garden or considering doing so, you can choose non-invasive plants, and there's a number of tips to help you do this. One option is to buy plants from native plant nurseries. If that's not an option for you, you can at least find out where your plants come from. So whatever nursery or plant center you visit to buy your plants, ask questions about where these plants came from and learn a bit about whether these plants are listed invasive species in Wisconsin. There are also tools available like MIPIN's Landscape Alternatives mobile app that can help you select non-invasive plants. Often these tools will share common ornamental invasive plants and then give suggestions for similar species that you can consider using instead. A second option in your own garden or yard is to not share aggressive plants. So examples of these aggressive plants include bishop's goutweed, which you see in the background, and common periwinkle or vinca, shown in the picture at the upper right. If you have aggressive ground cover plants like these, and they're taking over your yard, often one of our first thoughts is to share these plants with our neighbors and friends. But if the plants are showing aggressive tendencies in your yard, that likely means that if they escape into natural areas, they'll be very problematic in those areas. So consider disposing of these plants properly. Maybe you can compost them, or if it's a listed invasive species in Wisconsin, you can landfill these plants. And then if you are removing these aggressive plants, again, consider replacing them with non-invasive species. A third option in your own yard is to control these invasive plants. This will both help prevent the spread to your neighbor's property, but also help prevent spread to natural areas where these plants can be highly problematic. If you're not sure where to start, you can go to the UW Extension Learning Store and search for invasive species fact sheets. And these fact sheets will provide you identification information on many of our common invasive species, and then control recommendations with both non-chemical and chemical methods. Of course, there are a lot of things you can do beyond your own garden or yard as well to help prevent the spread of invasive species. One option is to report invasive plants where you find them. In particular, we like to get reports of plants that have naturalized. So these are plants that weren't planted on purpose, and they are now persisting on their own in the landscape. And there's 3 different ways that you can report these plants. You can fill out a form on the EdMaps website, you can use the Great Lakes Early Detection Network or GLEDN mobile app, or you can email me at the email address here. It takes some learning to learn how to use these different websites and apps, and we do have more information on how to report on the Wifton website listed here, and then in additional videos. Another option outside of your own yard is to volunteer to remove invasive plants in a local natural area. Many of our local, county, and state parks have scheduled work parties regularly throughout the year, and if your local park doesn't have work parties yet, you can start them. Other good places to go to remove invasive plants are along recreational trails, including bike trails and ATV and snowmobile trails. These are areas where our invasive plants tend to spread prolifically, so it's a good place to look for and remove invasive plants. And don't forget our water bodies as well. A lot of invasive plants will travel through water, or the seeds will travel through water. And so along the shorelines of lakes and rivers is another good place to look for and remove invasives. Finally, A great way to help prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species is to continue to learn more about invasives and then teach others. The WIFTIN website listed here has a lot of resources, including videos and fact sheets where you can continue to learn more about invasive species. And we also provide in-person workshops. So if you or your group is interested in learning more about invasive plants and perhaps going out into the fields to learn more about them, you can always contact the Wisconsin First Detector Network. Today we learned about what defines an invasive plant, some impacts of these invasive plants, and what you can do to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive plants. If you have more questions about invasive plants, please don't hesitate to contact WIFTIN using the email address or phone number listed here.